Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, he's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. All right, let's talk about diversity. But before you think, oh my God, another one of those conversations, let me be clear. Yes, racial, gender, economic diversity, those are all very important. But what I'm talking about here is cognitive diversity. Moreover, divergent cognitive diversity. And why we need people who don't think like us if we're going to stay on the cutting edge of innovation. Why? Well, according to our guest today, the future of business and leadership requires genuine cognitive diversity, particularly at the executive level. More about that in a moment. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor, get over to wherever it is you tune into the podcast from and rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Share it with other people. We really appreciate it. And you know what? Every now and then we're going to do a big shout out to you when you've done one of those reviews. We really appreciate it. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. But I know you're curious, so we'll jump in. Our guest today for the next 2 episodes is Dr. Dan Hill, Ph.D. He is an internationally recognized expert on the role of emotions in business, in politics, and in sports. His wide-ranging media coverage has included the front page profile on the New York Times and appearances on ABC's Good Morning America, NBC's The Today Show, EQ expert who has pioneered the use of facial coding in business to capture quality emotional responses. His company, Sensory Logic Inc., has done work for over 50% of the world's top 100 B2C companies. And he's the author of 10 books, including Famous Faces Decoded and 2 Cheers for Democracy. His latest book is Emotionomics 2.0, the emotional dynamics underlying key business goals. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome returning champion, Dr. Dan Hill.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you, sir. Good to have you here.
Absolutely. What a rousing introduction. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, mate. So let's jump in because, you know, you and I, we are very big on emotions and it's a part of I feel like it's a part of culture that is so often poo-pooed, missed, or misunderstood at least. And I feel like when we get down to it, every human being has an origin story about what gives our lives purpose. And that is actually something that is deeply tied into our emotions. What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
I think it actually goes back to a conversation I had with my mother. Someone in New York had once said to me, if you really want to know someone, ask the question, what does your mother think about you? It will catch them off guard and they will inadvertently, spill the beans on how things really work. If you ask that question, my mother, she would say, Dan's a bit of a, fanatic, that he is so hyper energetic. He is always exploring. He's always pushing, and he's pushing away from me. He is trying to find other things in life. So I finally asked my mom, where do you think this instinct comes from that I am so exploratory? And she devastated me in a very nice way by being so honest. And she said, I was part of the silent generation. My father insisted that she either marry him now or the relationship, they were high school sweethearts, was over. So she married, but she did not actually want to leave school and become a mother. She felt really bad about that because her mom had worked in a hospital and raised funds specifically so her daughters could go to school. And my mom admitted that she had this real hesitation about being a mother. And therefore, that ambivalence I felt intuitively. Mm-hmm. And my goal, I think, in business and life is to actually make people feel like they are wanted, that they are connected, that they can be engaged, that they're not going to flee to the hinterlands because they don't feel like they have an emotional home. And so that does bring me to EQ, but it brings me really to the power of connection and how much more we can accomplish when we feel someone's there with us, beside us, behind us. And I applaud my mother for her honesty in giving me an answer that, frankly, I did not expect.
I'll bet that must have been a surprise. I think if I'd have asked my mom, she probably would have said something very similar because my curiosity drove her insane. And she would have said, you're pulling away constantly. And I was always exploring because I was so curious about everything. But again, it was because I felt like everybody around me sort of bought into this idea that they were stuck, but not necessarily where they wanted to be. It's one thing to be stuck where you want to be, but to be stuck where you don't want to be is a whole different gig.
Yes, exactly. In fact, my mom tells the story that I was on my tricycle heading out of town. She found me on a country road, tricycling away from home as fast as I could go. That's not a normal reaction. No. And some of it came from, I guess I'll expand on the story a bit because I think it's going to pertain to leadership, because my father was a executive leader for 3M Company and a good man, but he had a problem with anger. And I would tell you that in business, that seems to be the one emotion that is always acceptable, is to be angry, to be pushing to, achieve more, control your destiny. But that's not the only emotion, and that's not an emotion that's necessarily constructive to forming those connections, because anger as an emotion is about also hitting out. And my father did literally hit me. And if I was fleeing and seeking better pastures, there was a reason for all of that. Sure. And so I'm being very revelatory here. But I think it's going to pertain to surprise and fear and anger and a lot of things that this conversation needs to get into if we're going to talk about really bringing out the best in people and achieving diversity in the workplace.
Well, let's talk about this for a moment, because again, anger, I think, is a grossly misunderstood emotion. I mean, like I said, this is an area for both of us that we're very passionate about, but anger is often misunderstood because we tend to categorize emotions and feelings as good or bad, as opposed to the application being good or bad. So I will often work with my private clients and say, one of your problem? And they go, what? I go, I don't know where your anger is. And they go, well, isn't it that a bad thing? And I'm like, I say, it's terrible that you don't know where your anger is. And they go, well, why? Isn't that, it's good that I don't have it. And I go, no. Because without anger, nothing changes. If you're not pissed off enough to do something about something, it's not about striking out at somebody, but it's about giving yourself the fire, the chutzpah, the energy to do things. And that anger is good. It's the anger that allowed Gandhi to get rid of the British in India. It's the anger that allowed the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King. It's the anger that fired up Nelson Mandela, even though it was done very peacefully. We need that force too. And I think that when you've had a childhood like you and I had, where you had a very angry parent, you automatically then go, well, anger's bad. But we've had to learn to use that anger, right?
Yes, no, anger has a lot of positive upsides. So you have anger when you want to control your destiny. You have anger when you want to make progress. You have anger when you think there's barriers to progress and they're unfair. So anger can really be a taproot to what's meaningful to you. What's your value system? And in all of those aspects, I think it's tremendously impactful. It's also it's an approach emotion. So you are trying to move toward your solution.
Mm-hmm.
So that is good. And the hitting part and being a tyrannical control freak, that's where we start to get into the problems.
Yeah, not so good.
Not so good.
So do you think, because you said there in that, you said that you think that anger is still an accepted, that negative, aggressive, attacking anger is still sort of acceptable in leadership. Do you really still believe that?
Well, I maybe would back it off in leadership. I would say in the management ranks where they feel squeezed between the employees and the executives. Right. I think there's so much evidence out there that bullying is taking place in the workplace and is not being closed off. So I think the leadership is complicit in that to the extent that those bullies are not being removed. And so I don't know that there's a problem always in the leadership ranks. But I think certainly in middle management ranks, there's plenty of proof.
Right. So let's just go quickly to solution there for a moment, because, as you said, these guys are really the meat in the sandwich. They've got the people they're trying to lead on one end. They've got the executives pressuring them on the other. And we know, we've got lots of research that's come back since the pandemic around people, of course, with the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. People are not really high performing, and there's just not enough people to do the work. And these managers are feeling that pressure and that tension within themselves that is spilling out. We can't wave the magic wand and suddenly give them 10 more employees. So what is the solution for these guys?
Well, I think they need to recognize what the shortcomings are of the current approach. The lashing out is not going to work. It's going to drive people away. There was a wonderful book looking at police reform, because the police people are in charge of the beat. They're in the neighborhood. Right. And what they discovered was that there was a small number of hot spots and hot habits. Typically per city, only like 1% to 2% of the city blocks is where most of the serious crime took place. I would tell you that HR needs to get off the sidelines. I know they don't always feel empowered, but it's not good enough just to do a pulse survey and hope people turn them back in and they're halfway honest. And then you put it into a PowerPoint and don't do any interventions. I mean, I think you got to get a lot more granular. I think you need trust audits. I mean, what is going on in some of these departments? Why do we have turnover rates that we sometimes see? So I think you got to put a little bit more transparency on these people, because no one likes to be embarrassed. Bullies are actually usually cowards when it comes down to it, and they don't like confrontations. So I think you got to put them in situations where they realize I'm going to get exposed, I'm going to be outnumbered, I could be embarrassed, I could be dismissed. And if you just get a few of the worst apples out of there, because this criminologist's book that I'm talking about said that even other gang members are afraid of the crazy gang members, the ones who are the hyper violent ones, and they could be liberated. They can be turned and be better performers and better people in terms of interacting if they're just given the green light that this is going to turn into a safe environment. And so getting just a few bad apples out and exposing them, and I think the trust audits is one way to do it. I think another way is when the reviews are done, and we could go into a whole conversation about annual performance reviews and whether they should die on the vine or not. But I think one thing is when you get someone who controls and sits on your neck and dominates your future at a company, you're going to be very vulnerable, and that bully's getting a green light potentially.
Yes,
a second person of equal weight or even greater weight in that conversation who's not superfluous, who actually knows a bit of what's going on in the department. Maybe they're a department mentor, or a from another parallel unit in the company. I think getting a second voice in that conversation would do wonders for making the bullies realize they can't be the small county sheriff who rides roughshod over everybody.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's really important what you said about the importance of HR getting off the sidelines. I mean, I've talked about this. I've written a lot about this, about how HR is kind of the paper tiger of the executive suite, the toothless tiger, because and it's not okay, because I think in many ways HR has become the buffer zone between management and legal, as opposed to saying, let's roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty. And that's why I was asking you, do you think it's as prevalent? Because a lot of people are very nervous now about backlashing, whether that's, cancel culture or whatever it is, there's lawsuits and all kinds of things. So I think that there's a lot more we can do around that. But before we go too far down that road, let's pull back a bit, because I want people to grasp what we started to talk about right at the very beginning, which is cognitive diversity. You
Sure.
and I talked about this previously in a previous conversation that was not recorded, and we talked about how there's this big push for diversity, where you need to employ people of different sexual orientation, different color, different race, different culture, different economic backgrounds, whatever it is. Okay. But oftentimes, as you and I were talking about, it's like, we need you to look different, but think the same.
Yeah.
Right. So talk to us about the need for cognitive diversity, because this is something that you and I are very passionate about. And I want to hear from you and have our listeners understand it from your wisdom and your background.
Well, I think the emotion we need to talk about in terms of getting to cognitive diversity is curiosity. Both of us admitted that that's kind of a benchmark, a hallmark for us.
My religion.
Yeah. And I think that's the key place to go, because someone who is truly curious is not going to be willing to just phone in the usual answers or fall silent. They're going to press and ask questions. And question storming, we do brainstorming. I'm actually more interested in question storming, why that assumption, and keep delayering it and moving it along. So I want to know, what books were when I'm hiring somebody, what books were expansive for them, who are their heroes, where have they put themselves into situations where they knew they didn't know a whole lot going in. I'll give you a wonderful example of someone who I know was curious. A good friend of mine landed in Vietnam the very day that the Tet Offensive started. It saved his life because the village was overrun the first day. And he ended up at the R&R camp. They said, everyone in country. And then they said, but we need one person to stay behind. And my friend Joe said, what's the catch? What's the qualification? We need someone who can fix the helicopters. And Joe said, do you have a manual? And they said, yes. And Joe shot his hand up and said, I'm your guy. He had the willingness to step into a situation where the stakes were really high, because you crash that helicopter, you've killed, 10, 12 mates of yours. You're going to get court-martialed. But a manual and the willingness to learn and step forward gave him that opportunity to actually shine in the role.
Right.
So I think you have to have people who, yes, the racial, the religious, all those diversity things can be great, but they're not a panacea. They're not a godsend. They're not a guarantee. I need someone who's challenged orthodoxy. And that's what I'm looking for. And whatever line of questions or examples, stories that they can tell in hiring. And then I need at least a second person in any meaningful team, because there's a lot of research to show that there's enough peer pressure out there. Even the really curious person could buckle.
Right.
Yes, possibly.
Right.
So give them a fellow travel mate who's got that same curiosity burning. Put them on your key committees, and then I think you've just upped your chances of trying to crack that nut and get someplace better. Because whatever the task at hand, I think hopefully they're going to keep pressing.
So we have let's pretend we have an organization, we have a particular problem that we're confronting.
Sure.
And there's, let's say, 8 members on this team. and we're trying to solve this problem. But if we even have 7 of those people who are somewhat conformist, even though they might not willingly admit that, they tend to be a little sycophantic, to say the least, right? And they'll tug their forelock and say yes and get along with it. But we've got one person who's curious. The challenge with that, their cognitive diversity makes them an outsider.
Yes.
And what you're suggesting is the solution to that is to have somebody else on the team who is also that way, so that now it's not just, it's not just Dov or Dan who's a pain in the ass because he's always asking awkward questions, but it's, well, hold on a minute. Dov and Dan both came at this from not necessarily the same point of view, but a different point of view from what we were looking at. It is now there's an impetus to take things on. Is that it? Have I got that right?
Yeah, you've got an ally, and then you've got some momentum, because momentum is very emotional, and
Yes.
people got to get pushed out of their comfort zone. I'll give you an example that I think is, sometimes you have a project and you kind of know it's not going to go well, that you maybe don't have the right team on board, the authority, your mandate, your directions are vague, and then you end up with the post-mortem where you kind of try to bury the dead without anyone knowing about it. I would favor the pre-mortem. When you get an assignment, anonymously, make everyone anonymously write a critique of what could go wrong, and then pull it together. And then hopefully the curious types really pull at Superman's cape and say, what are the problems here? And let's really honestly explore this pre-mortem diagnoses. And I think that could save people a lot of grief and a lot of wasted effort and money and time, because I think we do know there's situations where we're all, it's round up the usual suspects time, and it really shouldn't be, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I think it's vital. Let's go to the title of your book. I know that it's a 2.0, Emotionomics. So just for our audience's understanding, what do you mean by Emotionomics?
I mean that there are 2 currencies in life, especially in business, and one is, sure, the dollar, the pound, whatever, but the other one is emotions. We all have them. If you go back to Latin, of all things, motivation and emotion have the same root word, to move, to make something happen. Emotions make things happen. They drive performance. They drive behavior. It is amazing to me how emotionally illiterate we are about this really important currency in our lives. So Emotionomics 2.0 is a build off of the book I'd written 15 years earlier, laying this case out there that we have to pay attention to emotions. It's not just customer satisfaction or trust. Those are the usual suspects that we rely on.
Well, those are results.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly I think those points are great, but whatever he's missing is that those are results of emotion.
Yeah, they're down the road.
Right.
And what made them possible, what limited them, what destroyed them in some cases. And so, the landscape's changed a lot. I think the employee experience has become really central in those 15 years since I wrote the original edition. So that was a big change. A lot of things have moved digital, so we have a lot more diversity, but also antagonism online. So, emotions, if anything, have gotten more important rather than less important in the past 15 years.
You said something just a moment ago that I think it's really easy for people to skip past, because we know that people are usually doing things when they listen to podcasts, and I want you to underline it. So please tell us again what you said about the Latin root.
Sure. Movere, to move, to make something happen, is actually the root word for both emotion and motivation. Right. And every executive is going to talk about, I need you to be motivated. I need you to lean in to make this project happen. But you don't get there cognitively. You get there with a feeling in the heart, something that taps into your identity, your values, meaning, that's really going to propel you forward. You have no fuel in the gas tank of the car without emotions.
Exactly. And so in part 2 of the show, I want to talk about that from the perspective of, because I'm the first person to say, when people say, oh, you're a motivational speaker, I want to punch them in the throat. It's like, I am not a motivational speaker, because motivational speakers are how to hype you up and give you a suntan that will last a couple of days and then it fades away. I want to get to the root of your emotional fuel that will drive you for a very long distance. And you're talking a lot about that in Emotionomics 2.0, about how to use the emotion rather than trying to motivate. I need you to be motivated. What the hell do you mean? Right? I need you to self-love. Okay, well, I'm rubbing my nipples. Is it working? I don't think so, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not into platitudes.
No, exactly.
I'm into results, just like you.
Right.
Yep.
So I want to dive into that in depth as we come back into part 2 of it, and particularly in the context of how that becomes part of innovation. Because again, innovation is this, it's very much perceived as a cognitive thing, right? I've got to get into this innovative mindset. And what I know for certain is, if you don't have the right emotional state, it's never going to happen, right?
Yeah, no, it's going to be stillborn.
Right,
Yeah.
It's going to be stillborn. Very well put. So I want to come back to that in part 2 of the show. There's a lot of places we can explore, and we will explore. Before we do that, before we come to the end of part 1, I'd love for you to tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you, Dan, more about your books, and all the other resources that you have available.
Well, that's very kind of you, but I'm going to be super brief about it. Just go to the website, www.sensorylogic.com. I've got all the books there. You can see the topics, the issues that, spur me forward. And that suffices. You can buy the books right off the website.
All right. So sensorylogic.com.
Yep. That's the ticket. That does
it. So as I said, we will make sure we post that in the show notes. And of course, you can find Dan on LinkedIn as well. And we'll make sure you post a link to that as well. So we're going to be back in just one click. Till then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about your cognitive diversity and how you're approaching cognitive diversity. Are you turning your back on it? Are you conforming rather than actually adding the value you want? And have you recognized that the fuel in your tank is emotion, and that rather than seeing it as a bad thing, see it as the thing that is going to fuel that tank that you can tap in not only yourself, but in everybody that you work with? We're going to be back in one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.